Kia ora and hello everyone. Welcome to the Special Olympics Coach Webinar Series 2024. This is presented by our official sponsor, Gallagher. A huge thank you to Gallagher for their continued support as the official sponsor of the Special Olympics Sport and Coaching Programming. Thank you all for joining today's webinar as we look to offer coaches more learning opportunities around the areas you want to learn about. Today's webinar is all about learning and teaching in Special Olympics. Just a couple of housekeeping rules before we get into the webinar is that this webinar offers concurrent interpretation in 8 languages, which is English, Spanish, French, Arabic, Portuguese, Chinese, Russian, and Italian. You can choose your language by using the globe button at the bottom of the screen. If you have any questions that you have for the speakers, please add them to the chat box or use the Q&A function. But you might be wondering though, who am I? Well, let me tell you a little bit about me. My name is Payne from Special Olympics New Zealand. I'm 25 years old. I'm autistic and an athlete who competes in powerlifting and basketball, and I'm a Sargent Shriver Global Messenger representing the Asia Pacific region. I've been involved with Special Olympics since 2008 through the schools program, which has led me to join my local Special Olympics club, which is counties, in 2010. Throughout my years, I've competed in 4 other sports and competed at the World Summer Games in 2019 in Abu Dhabi as part of the New Zealand's men's basketball team. As an athlete leader, I joined the county's athlete leadership program group in 2015, and then I did my athlete leadership program training with Special Olympics New Zealand in 2017. I now have athlete leadership roles within New Zealand, Asia Pacific, and now internationally. With my new role as a Sargent Shriver Global Messenger, we as spokespeople for the movement lead the campaign for a more inclusive world for people with intellectual disabilities. We challenge the mindsets of political leaders, policymakers, educators, employers, and society to create a positive change to make our world a more inclusive place for everyone. Tonight we're all here because we are coaches, or we want to be coaches in Special Olympics. I'm also a coach. And throughout the week, I help coach a team strength and fitness class and also adapted athletes program of powerlifting and fitness classes at my local powerlifting gym. I'm always learning from my coaches how I can be the best coach I can be to help everybody succeed. The skills I like seeing as a coach is someone who is willing to really understand me, how my mind works, and adapt to help me become a better athlete. With basketball being a team sport, my coach knows our individual strengths and work-ons and how to make the team dynamic work. He teaches us different plays that we'll do in a game, but also adapts to us as needed, so everyone's able to understand and be on the same page, and it just works. Whereas powerlifting with our coach, it's more one-on-one or individualized. They really know you, how you lift, how you think about everything, what your technique looks like, and how to teach new things to you in a way that you understand. It's pretty unique because how my coach coaches me, like in back squat, for example, is different to how he would coach my dad, who also competes. And again, it just works. Now, I would love to introduce our presenter for the webinar is Dr. Rebecca Shangraw. Dr. Shangraw is a senior lecturer of applied human development in the BU-Wheelock College of Education and Human Development, where her research interest involves identifying and investigating recommended teaching practices to use when instructing athletes who have specific learning disabilities, ADHD, and autism spectrum disorders. I don't know about you, but this sounds so cool to do. So let's just give a huge welcome to Rebecca. Over to you.
Thank you, Grace. Hello, everybody. It's great to see you all here. I just really want to say thank you to Grace for such a wonderful introduction and for being so involved with Special Olympics. So thank you very much, Grace. I'm just going to jump right in and share my presentation here. Here we go. So teaching and learning in Special Olympics. So a lot of people are often thrown off when I present this kind of information, and then they ask, well, we're coaching. Why are we talking about teaching and learning? And so the purpose of this presentation really is to answer that question. So there are two guiding thoughts that I have for us today. One is this big idea that coaches are teachers. We ask athletes to learn from us, to learn game strategy and to learn new skills. We ask them to think about what they're doing in kind of a really critical way. And we ask them to perform their skills or demonstrate their knowledge for us. That's all that competition is. Competition is like a big math test, except it's a little more fun. So what I'm challenging you to think about today is how coaches actually are teachers. And the more we learn about educating and the process of learning, I think the better coaches we can be. So that's the big idea I want you to keep in mind today. The other thing I'd like you to keep in mind is this guiding question of how can I help my athletes learn, or how can I help my athletes learn more? And so really my goal for the next 40 minutes or so is to help answer that question. How can I help my athletes learn? So today, this is just a quick overview for what we're going to be talking about. We're going to start with this kind of intimidating thing called Bloom's taxonomy, but I'm going to make it really enjoyable and easy to understand, so don't worry. Then we'll go into a quick mention of developmental appropriateness, and then we're going to talk about the bread and butter of the talk, which is information processing and ways to help our athletes negotiate the information processing process or stream. So we're going to start with Bloom's taxonomy, and it sounds boring, and I promise you it's not boring. It's actually really cool. So a while ago, like really in the 50s, this guy named Benjamin Bloom came up with a way to talk about or to organize what people learn. And basically, he said there are three domains of learning. So there's a psychomotor or a physical domain of learning. And that's really, as Special Olympics coaches, that's where we spend a lot of our time. We're helping people develop their physical skills. So learning how to hit a ball, how to shoot a basket, how to dive into a pool. Those are all physical or psychomotor skills. Then there's a second domain of learning called affective learning. And that's where that learning involves feelings and social skills and emotions. So things like sportsmanship, learning how to win or lose with your head up or with grace. That's an affective skill. High-fiving the other team after a competition's over, that's an affective skill. So there are actually many affective skills in sport. So that's a very important domain for us as coaches. And then the third domain that Bloom recognized in this model is cognitive skills or thinking skills. That involves game strategy. That involves things like understanding when to run up a field and understanding when to run down a field, understanding if there's a clock running during a competition, understanding what that clock represents and what it means for you if you only see that there are, let's say, 10 seconds left in your competition. So the cognitive domain of learning is also very important to us as coaches. So we're going to be keeping this model in mind as we move through this presentation, so we have a more organized way of talking about how we teach our athletes and how they learn from us. Here's an example of Bloom's taxonomy. I know some people learn better with examples. I certainly do. So if we use swimming as an example, a psychomotor skill could be the ability to perform various strokes. That's pretty clear, I think. An affective skill in swimming could be sportsmanship and teamwork. I gave examples before. So, being successful in a competition gracefully, or maybe not coming out on top in a competition and handling that well as well. That's an affective skill. And then a cognitive example or cognitive skill in swimming would be remembering the order of all the strokes in an individual medley. I apologize, my dog is right here. In an individual medley. And I will say that is a cognitive skill I used to struggle with personally when I was on a swim team. And if I still swam, I would probably still be working on this skill to this day. But anyway, this is an example from the swimming world of the 3 domains of learning. We can use these domains of learning to then talk about common characteristics that affect our athletes' learning. And this is important to understand as coaches, because if we think of ourselves as teachers, we need to understand how best to help our athletes learn. So we need to know where they are as learners. So this is a list of generalities that, not everybody has everything or all conditions on this list, but they are considerations that are that we as coaches should be aware of. So in this cognitive domain of learning, we see processing delays, difficulty generalizing new information, difficulty with memory, maybe some reduced attention span, and you can see the rest of the list. Then in the affective domain of learning, we see hesitance to try new things, resistance to change, maybe difficulty understanding, when and how to take turns, or difficulty with interpersonal communication. You can read the rest of the list. And then in the physical domain of learning, sometimes we see things like tight muscle tone, loose joints, poor balance, all these things either taken individually or maybe put together with other conditions or other symptoms of conditions really can impact people's ability to learn. And like I said before, if we're aware of that, and if we're aware of how that can affect the information processing that we're about to talk about, I think it helps us as teachers kind of navigate that learning a little bit better. And I'll be more clear about that in a couple minutes. So moving on to developmental appropriateness, this actually intersects directly with Bloom's taxonomy, and let me explain what I'm talking about. As coaches, we need to make sure that what we're asking our athletes to do, or what the goals that we set for our athletes at the end of the day, we need to make sure that those goals are appropriate to the capabilities of our athletes. And as coaches, we need to recognize that very often across the globe, in neurotypical people or people with any sort of disability, the domains of physical skill, affective skill, and cognitive skill may not all be at the same levels. So as you can see on this slide, it's very, very rare that we come across an athlete who is very strong physically in the affective domain and cognitively. It's very rare. It's more common, again, across the globe, no matter what athletes you coach. It's way more common to see variability across these domains of physical skill, affective skill, and cognitive skill. So as we're setting goals and expectations for our athletes, we should keep that in mind, right? So just because an athlete is incredibly physically gifted, they actually may need a little bit more help with their cognitive skills and their cognitive understanding of the game or their sport that they're in. On the reverse, you may have an athlete who's incredibly bright, very, very bright, and maybe physically gifted as well, but on the affective side, right? When you're looking at their ability to work as a teammate or maybe share their feelings in a productive way, maybe they need some work on that. So as coaches, we need to identify where our athletes are very, very strong in these domains, and then where they can use a little bit more support. And we need to remember to help them build all 3 domains and not just focus on the physical one, right? So when we're preparing for competition, we need athletes who are physically prepared, but also who have an understanding of what will be asked of them during the competition, and who also have an understanding of sportsmanship and teamwork and communication and all those other things that go into the affective skills. So we'll move on to information processing, which is really, that's why we're here today. So information processing is basically how we learn. It's a model. And this is a visual that kind of explains the information processing model. And this is the same for every human being on the planet. We all share this way of taking in information. So when a coach speaks to an athlete, or when an athlete is watching a game on the field, or maybe watching a video of a professional sport on TV, there is sensory input going into the athlete's brain. And the sensory input can come from any one of our senses: smelling, hearing, taste, feeling. What did I forget? Feeling, hearing, taste, smelling, hearing. Well, oh, seeing. I don't know, whatever. Seeing. All the senses that you learn in school. So when we see something, when we hear something, maybe when we feel something with our hands, that's all giving our brain these little data points, these little clues, this information, and it's going into our brain from the sensory receptors. Once it's in our brain has to make has to interpret what is going on. And if you think about it, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of data points going into our brain, like per second, you know. The sun is shining, there's a car that I can hear, you know, a little distance away from me. The wind is blowing. I have a partner who's about to kick a soccer ball in my direction. You know, the coach is over here blowing a whistle. So there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of data points going into your brain in any 1 second. So when they arrive in your brain has to interpret all that data really, really, really quickly in order to keep functioning in that scenario. So typically, when the brain has to interpret all that data, it's going to rely on past experience. So the sun is shining. That's okay, because I've been outside when the sun is shining before and everything went great. The wind is blowing. Okay. All right. I might feel a little bit uncomfortable if the wind starts to make me cold, but for now, I'm okay. Et cetera, et cetera. This is all happening constantly in our brains over and over and over again, every single second of the day. Based on the interpretation of the sensory data, then you go into decision making. So your brain has to decide how it's going to act or react to every single piece of the sensory input. Sometimes the decision is not to do anything. Most of the time, it's not to do anything. Based on the decision-making process, we go into output, which is the action that you're going to take. So if your brain sees the partner across from you about to kick a soccer ball in your direction, the output based on your decision-making could be to get in a ready stance to get ready to receive the ball that's about to be kicked in your direction. And then there's feedback. So then your brain kind of watches what happens based on the output, and the feedback goes into your brain. Your brain kind of records it, kind of like, well, that worked well, or well, that was an epic failure. And then that feedback is recorded, and your brain remembers that for the next time it's met with that type of scenario again. This is ongoing and ongoing and ongoing. Yes, so I'll go to the next slide. Sometimes people struggle to understand just how much sensory input our brain is dealing with every single second of the day. So here's just an example from this picture here. So here we have a little boy at bat with his coach behind him. It looks like the coach is trying to be helpful by giving him some verbal pointers there. So the sources of sensory input that we can see from just this snapshot, the second in time in this picture, include the little boy is listening to his coach. The little boy is watching the pitcher. So the brain is interpreting the pitcher's moves and the pitcher's stances. The smell of the field, it may smell like dirt or fresh cut grass or something else. Seeing the other players on the field and figuring out what the other players are doing. Seeing and hearing the fans in the stands. The little boy is also dealing with sensory input in terms of feeling his hands on the bat, the helmet on the head. As a former softball athlete, I remember the helmet was always very distracting because it never fit me comfortably. He might have some bubble gum in his mouth, so that's another source of sensory input that the brain is navigating. A little boy could be listening to traffic drive by his field, and then feeling the sun on his skin. So from all of those sources of sensory input, the brain is constantly saying, okay, this has to be dealt with, this does not have to be dealt with. So for instance, the hot sun on the skin, that is a situation probably for this little boy where the brain is saying, we're not going to worry about it. We felt hot sun before, it's fine. But with the coach talking to the little boy behind him, the brain is probably saying, listen to the coach, analyze what the coach is saying, make adjustments if that's what the coach is telling you to do. So there's a lot of things that the brain is navigating when it's taking in all this sensory input. And that brings me to this really important point that coaches should really, really be aware of, which is sticking points in our information processing model. Because as coaches, it's our job to recognize that there probably are some sticking points through information processing and to ask ourselves, what can we do to reduce the sticking points and really to make it easier for information to go from sensory input all the way out to output. And as you can imagine, anywhere during the information processing cycle, we can see a sticking point. Many sticking points happen during sensory input. And that's basically because there's so much input going to their brain. Like in that example I just showed you, there's the coach talking to the little boy. There could be some athletes on the field who have the wiggles and they're moving all around. There could be cars zooming past the field. There's a lot for their brain to think about analyzing. And as Special Olympics coaches, we also have athletes who may have cognitive sticking points at other places during information processing. So it could be in interpreting what they're seeing. It could be in decision making. It could be in the output. So in actually knowing how to act or react to the sensory stimuli. And then it could be in feedback. So it could be in making a decision, taking an action, based on a sensory input, but then maybe the brain needs some help remembering the outcome of that incident, so that it can lean on it in the future. So basically, to summarize all this, the information processing model kind of explains how people identify information, how it kind of sits in the brain figures it out, and then the brain decides to act on it. And the takeaway from this slide is at any point in this model, there can be confusion or there can kind of be a hiccup. And the rest of this presentation will be about how to make this process a little bit smoother or easier for our athletes. So the first thing we can do when we're trying to make the information processing model or this process smoother for our athletes is to try to identify any sticking points that may exist. And this is really, really hard, right? Because you can't open up our brain and, it's not like a car engine where you open up the hood and you can see something that's broken. We don't have that luxury. So we have to kind of figure it out without really seeing what's going on. So the two suggestions I have are here on this slide. And the first one is, I think, the most important, which is talk to the athlete, and or if it's appropriate, their caregiver, and ask the athlete, how do you like to learn? Do you like seeing pictures? Do you like it when I explain something with my voice? Do you like just to, move with your body just so you can figure out the skills I'm trying to teach you? Do you like to see something on a TV screen? Do you like it when I, draw a little diagram? How do you like to learn the best? Because really we should be asking our athletes first and foremost all these questions, because they're the learners. They're the people who matter the most. So after you talk to the athlete, you can also do this thing, and I stole this term from the mathematics world, called guess and check. So if you're not familiar with the term, guessing and checking is basically in math, where you have a formula or an equation, and you plug in a number just to see if it's going to solve the equation. And if it works, great, good on you. And if it doesn't work, back to the drawing board, and you have to plug in a different number and see if the equation works. So guessing and checking in this scenario is basically going through each stage of the information processing. We'll call it a loop, the feedback, the loop, and making slight adjustments one by one to each stage of the information processing loop to see if that helps the athlete. So you can, if you're basically a verbal teacher, so if you do a lot of directing verbally to your athletes, maybe try to work in some visuals, or we call it kinesthetic learning. So have athletes up and moving their bodies a little bit more, and see if that helps with their information processing. Then you can make adjustments to the helping athletes with interpretation. So what that looks like is you can do a lot of thinking out loud. So, Jason, when you kick the ball that hard, it was really hard for your partner to trap it. So what do you think? How do you think you should adjust with the next kick? So really, really thinking out loud about what was experienced and the result of that. Then you can move on to giving options for decisions. So you can say to Jason, all right, so you kicked the ball really, really hard and it looks like your partner had trouble trapping it. So could you kick the ball with a little bit less force? Could you kick the ball a little bit softer? Or whatever other option, or maybe a different kind of kick. But so giving options for decisions, giving options for output. So you could say, you could angle your foot a little bit in a different way, Jason. You could do some other adjustments to the body so that the kick is different. And then you talk through the feedback. So you say, all right, Jason, you kicked the ball a little softer and it looks like your partner was able to receive it a little bit better. What do you think? Should you keep kicking that way? Then that helps Jason analyze the feedback of the scenario. So for the rest of the presentation, we're going to talk about supporting information processing and the ways we can do that. This is specifically supporting information processing with our athletes. The goals of supporting information processing with our athletes are these four things here on the screen. We want to minimize the noise, and the noise refers to all the extraneous sensory input that could be coming into our athletes' brains that actually really have nothing to do with our sport or our practice or our competition. So if we can get rid of all that extraneous stuff, or a lot of the extraneous stuff, our brains will know where to focus, which goes to number 2. We can explicitly tell the brain where to focus, and that will help our athletes. Number 3, we can remind the brain what it already knows. And when we remind the brain what it already knows, learning new things feel a little bit less intimidating, right? Because because when you learn something from absolute scratch, that's like the scariest thing. So if you tell the brain, no, you've already done like half this before. You're fine. You're good. That will give the brain more confidence in it. The brain could be more willing to try a new skill. And then number 4 is something many coaches struggle with, which is giving our athletes' brains time to digest and just sit and take in the new information. We can call it the settling time sometimes in the education world. So just giving athletes a little bit more time to respond to a question, that can help the brain digest. So how can we do these things? How can we accomplish numbers 1 through 4? We're going to talk about this next. So we're going to talk about structure and consistency with our practices, activating prior knowledge when we introduce new skills or concepts, clarity and simplicity when we interact with our athletes, and then opening and closing skills. So structure and consistency in our practices. So, and you can see up on the right-hand corner of the slide here, I have the symbols for our Bloom's taxonomy domain. So this is really good for the affective and the cognitive domains of learning, structure and consistency. So my recommendation is that with your practices, you establish routine and predictability on day 1. When you establish routine and predictability, you're reducing the cognitive load around extraneous things, like I was saying before. So if athletes feel assured, if they know, okay, after a half hour, coach always gives us the water break. So even if I get a little thirsty, during the skill practice, I know that there's a water break like right after it. So I'm just going to focus on the skill practice because I know I'm going to get water right after. Things like that. So when your athletes don't have to worry, they're able to focus more on you and on their skill development. And obviously that relieves things like anxiety and worry, and nothing clogs up information processing more than anxiety and worry. So we can establish routine and predictability by making our practice schedules consistent every single practice. So for instance, athletes come in, they know they put their bag down in a certain area, they circle up in the middle of your gym, they know that they stretch with whatever routine of stretches, then the coach gives an overview of the practice, and then you do skill practice, a game, water break, skill practice, a game, water break, scrimmage. Every single practice, every single time, no matter what. So then the athletes know that they're going to have an opportunity to get water at set points, use the restroom or the bathroom at set points. They won't be bugging you saying, can we scrimmage, can we scrimmage, can we scrimmage? Because that's the most fun part, because they know they're going to get to scrimmage at the end. So that reliable practice schedule can take away a lot of anxiety and worry. The physical layout of your practices, it also helps if it's consistent. So if the pennies or the jerseys are always in the same area, so the athletes don't have to ask you where they are. If the equipment is always laid out in the same place, so the athletes know that if they need a ball, they always go to whatever, the blue basket to go get a ball. Using common language is also good. This ties into cues. So if your common language and your cues always mean the same thing, then you're not going to have as many miscommunications with your athletes. So for instance, I once observed a coach who was a basketball coach, and on one day I saw him, he said, hands up, hands up, hands up to his athletes, meaning when you're on defense in basketball, put your hands up. And he raised his arms over his head to pair hands up with a physical cue as well. And the next time I observed him, he was saying hands up, but it was for a completely different reason. It was not in reference to defense. It was I don't even remember what it was in reference to, but it wasn't in reference to defending a player. So that got a little bit confusing in his athlete's mind, because then when he said hands up, the athletes were then trying to figure out, well, which scenario is he referring to? The defensive strategy or something in offense. And expectations for behavior. So if, my recommendation is that coaches be consistent with their expectations for behavior. So there's no anxiety or worry over, if I kind of talk out of turn here, will the coach kind of get annoyed by it, or is it okay? Or is it okay if Billy talks out of turn, but not me? And why is that? Blah, blah, blah. So if you have expectations for behavior, just make them consistent. Activating prior knowledge. So this is a huge concept, huge, and we'll spend 1 minute on it. This guy, David Ausubel, again, an older educational researcher, he came up with this theory called subsumption theory. And basically all it says is, if you can connect a new concept to prior knowledge, the brain gets really happy about it. And when we connect new skills to stuff our athletes already know, their brains can more easily connect the new information to prior information, making it much easier for them to learn, and they feel more confident, right? It's less intimidating learning a new skill when you realize you already know how to do about 50% of it. An example could be if you have an athlete who comes in with no knowledge of badminton, but they have played tennis. One of the first things you can say to them is, "Oh, okay, you've played tennis. This is really, really similar to tennis. I think you're gonna see a lot of commonalities here." So immediately the brain's like, all right, I see a net. I see something that looks moderately like a tennis racket, right? I see the birdie going over a net that is kind of like a tennis ball. All right, I'm gonna draw a lot of generalizations here from tennis to badminton, and I'm gonna feel a little bit more confident. In some sports like gymnastics and swimming, there are movements and skills that are very, very unique to that sport. And so you might be teaching things like from scratch, like that people have never done before. And in those scenarios, it's harder to attach new information to prior knowledge. That's okay, because you can invent situations that create a baseline level of prior knowledge. One suggestion I have is during warm-ups, you can have athletes kind of do these unique movements, maybe under the guise of like a warm-up dance, right? So then when you teach the skill later in practice, you can say, remember in our warm-up dance, we did this with our arms. Remember that? It was a really cool dance. Well, now we're going to work on bounce passing. And guess what the movement for bounce passing is, right? So you can work in that follow through, that kind of weird, unique follow through for a bounce pass into your warm-ups, and then refer back to it when you actually do the skill later in practice. Clarity and simplicity. This is really good for the cognitive domain of learning. This directly just kind of gets a lot of noise and extraneous stuff out of the brain when people are learning. So when you introduce new concepts, really be mindful to limit distractions in your coaching or teaching environment. So, if people are watching, you can ask them just to politely keep it down, turn off any music. Make sure that your athletes don't have any thirst or restroom needs, so their brains aren't distracted by that, and just really create an environment where their brains are only focused on you. You can explicitly tell athletes where to look and focus. So if you're demonstrating a basketball dribble, for instance, you can tell them, watch my hand when I dribble, right? So the brain doesn't have to wonder, well, where am I looking? Coach has new sneakers on. I love those sneakers. No. Tell them to look at my hands. Look at my hands. Use visual markers. So instead of saying line up over there, you would say line up on that black line or that blue line, please. Again, taking that guesswork away from their brain so it can just focus on what you want it to focus on. Delivering one big message or point at a time. I've seen a lot of coaches and teachers load up their athletes' brains with like 10 new really, really important points before they then get them into a practice activity. And it's very, very difficult to remember a list of really, really important things when you're hearing it for the first time. So my recommendation is just focus on one big point at a time, reinforce it, and then add on another big point and reinforce it that way. Limit your talk time, which is something I'm not doing in this presentation, but coaches should when they're with their athletes. Really, if you can introduce a skill or a practice session or a game between like 30 seconds and 1 minute, that's really the sweet spot of attention span. And then providing time for the brain to process. So working in some opportunities for athletes just to clear their head, let everything digest and settle before you ask them for answers or ask them to perform a skill. That's good for the brain. And the last point I'll make is opening and closing skills. And this is a teaching concept that we talk a lot about in physical education. You can see up at the top right corner there. This involves affective, psychomotor, and cognitive learning. If we go back to Bloom's taxonomy, this is a big one. So many times the skills that we teach our athletes, and this, it could be teamwork, it could be game strategy, it could be diving into water, any kind of skill. They can be closed or opened. When we close a skill, we are increasing the predictability of the environment. So we're making it easier for the brain to concentrate. When we open a skill, we're decreasing the predictability of the environment. So we're making it way harder for the brain to concentrate and focus on one thing. You can look at these terms another way, and you can say when you close a skill, you're removing a lot of other factors that could be distractions. When you open a skill, you're adding in those distracting factors back into the mix. The ultimate open environment for skills is competition. It is your game environment. So many distractions exist during competition. Referees, umpires, whistles, shot clocks or time clocks, crowds, people cheering, et cetera, et cetera. So when we introduce new skills and an athlete might be kind of struggling to pick up on the skill, one suggestion I have is to close the environment, remove all that extra distracting stimuli so that you've created a learning environment where the brain can focus. Some of the things you can remove or calibrate would be the size of your playing space. So maybe you go from a huge field just down to a little patch of grass so that the brain only has to worry about, a small area. Things like, wind, light, and noise. Now I know we can't control wind, but we can go inside where there is no wind. We can add in more visual markers into our environments. So maybe if you're dancing, so the athlete can get this, using the visual markers in the ground, the athlete can get the steps down first. And then you slowly remove those visual markers. So, you're preparing more for competition. The presence of defense and teammates, crowds, and clocks. Nothing makes the brain panic like a clock. And I think that's true for everybody. Now, I know this could be a confusing concept. So I wrote in some examples here with each domain of learning. So in terms of physical skills, let's say we're open water swimming and we have an athlete learning the freestyle stroke or the crawl stroke. When we introduce the stroke, we can close the skill up by having the athlete practice it in a very, very predictable environment. So you can see here on the left, that predictable environment could be an indoor practice pool, right? Where they're the only athlete in the lane just practicing their freestyle stroke. Then you slowly open the skill up. So add in these other elements that they will face in competition, but are also distracting for the brain, until you get to a competition-like environment for open water swimming, which is, it could be in the middle of a lake or an ocean with competitors where you could be inadvertently getting kicked in the face, or splashed with water, or there's a current in open water where there isn't in the pool. So you could really open that skill up over time to prepare the athlete. But the point here being, while they're being introduced to the freestyle stroke, it's a lot easier to do it in a practice pool than in the actual open water. Affective skills. The example of closing and opening a skill, I chose high fives. So that's affective, to mark good work or a job well done. So that's actually a skill that some athletes, they do really struggle with. So to close it, you can work on it in a predictable environment. So maybe just practice, like a practice environment with your own team, folks that your athlete is comfortable with and knows is familiar with. And then you slowly open it up, open the skill up. Maybe you can bring in some new faces into practice, or have some other athletes, caretakers, come onto the field to do some high fives at the end of practice. So it's different faces. So you can slowly open that skill up, so that when you get into competition, it is the most open, it is the most challenging that skill will be, where the athlete will be presented with the opportunity to high five, people that they're unfamiliar with, maybe people from the other team, or community members, which could be challenging if you don't work on it, if you don't close the skill first. The third and the last example I have for you is the cognitive skills. And this is, as a basketball coach in Special Olympics, I know that this is one of the most challenging skills cognitively that our athletes are faced with in competition, which is in basketball, receiving a pass and then knowing when, how, and where to pass the ball next, or what to do next. Nothing gives you the deer in headlights situation more, I think, than getting a pass during a game in basketball. So what we can do is close this skill up quite a bit. So introduce the skill of passing a basketball in a quiet gymnasium, maybe just with partner passing, one partner passing the ball back and forth, very, very predictable. Then you slowly add in these distracting elements, more and more stimuli for the senses, slowly added in until you're preparing for the competition, in which case you add in defense. You add in yourself. You're a coach, maybe yelling out some suggestions for where and when to pass the ball. You're adding in fans, you're adding in a clock, buzzers, whistles, all those things that the brain will have to react to. So to wrap up and to tie all this back to the big idea and the guiding question, I hope, just listening for these 40 minutes, you've gotten this idea that coaches really are teachers. We really are imparting and sharing information to other people, and then we're asking them to demonstrate their knowledge back to us. That is the definition of teaching. And to answer our guiding question, how can I help my athletes learn? I hope you've picked up on these highlights here, keeping the 3 domains of learning in mind. So psychomotor or physical, affective, and cognitive domains of learning are all important to teach and to foster with our athletes. I hope you've learned about identifying sticking points throughout the information processing, we'll call it the loop. And I really hope that you've learned about supporting information processing through structuring consistency with your practices, activating prior knowledge, being clear and keeping things simple, and then opening and closing skills. And so that's what I have. I think we have a few minutes for questions. I'll stop sharing my screen now. I'm going to look in the chat. Jeff, thank you very much. Yeah, so Rebecca is talking about a single athlete. True. How do you cope with multiple athletes, each on their own progression in the 3 areas? At some point, you have to coach the group rather than the athlete. 100%. I get this question every single time I do a talk. So this is really where some tools and tricks of the trade come into play. So obviously, if you're lucky enough to have assistant coaches and other volunteers working with you, it's a great opportunity for one person maybe to lead a larger group, and for you to do some pullouts. One athlete at a time, just working on them with a skill one-on-one. We're all not that lucky to have a volunteer staff or a bunch of people helping us. So what do you do alternatively? There are some things you can do. So you can do station rotations. That's a popular one. So with station rotations, you can float around to the different stations, and that gives you some time to work with the smaller groups as they go through your stations or your skill practice. Then the other thing you can do is, if you still have a large group practice, I'm going to use basketball just because it's an activity or a sport that a lot of us are familiar with. If you are doing a dribbling drill, let's say, so you have whatever, a third of your team dribbling up and down, a third of your team up and down, a third of your team up and down, so you have 3 lines. You can start with the same goals for the drill for everybody, right? But then if you notice an athlete who just needs a little bit more help in a specific area of dribbling, you can stand next to the athlete and say, all right, Sarah, next time you go, let's see you do, I don't know, instead of doing a crossover dribble up, down, and back, let's just see you do your right hand. I want to see you do your right hand, Sarah. So you can keep the whole team going on this drill of dribbling down and back with various kinds of dribbles, but then you can be working with Sarah as she goes, and just close the skill up and then or open it. You may have an athlete who's crushing it with crossover dribble down and back, so then you can say, hey, whatever, let's see if you can go a little bit faster down and back with that crossover dribble, Billy. I think you're ready to progress here. But I do understand the question. It is very challenging when it's just you and a group of athletes and people are all different levels, 100%. And then I'm going to answer the second question we have here. How do you support learning in athletes who are very established in their ways, or less open to challenge? And how do you help prepare athletes in training for changes they will experience in competition? Yes. So the first part is, how can you support learning in athletes who are, that happens. Sometimes you just have to play into it. So if athletes are very established in their ways, lean into it, and I think give them challenges based on their interests. Sometimes if you work with an athlete closely enough, and they develop that trust and that attachment to you, you can kind of get them to broaden their horizons, to see that things can be done differently. And sometimes there will be moments where you provide them with certain challenges and things don't go right for them, and then they do the learning themselves. Then they see, oh, all right, well, that didn't go well. That's a great opportunity for you then to jump in and say, hey, that was a little bit unsuccessful, but what if you try it this way? So I think with the athletes who are a little bit hesitant to change, and I know exactly what you're talking about, I think if sometimes it's just lucky. Sometimes it's lucky that you're there in a moment where their brain is open and receptive to that suggestion to maybe try something another way. How do you help prepare athletes in training for changes and or challenges they will experience in competition? Yeah, so close to competitions, I start adding in the game-like feel. So I'll start inviting parents, caregivers, and friends actually to the practices, to stand on the sidelines or to sit in the bleachers, to cheer, to yell, to be on the phone, to try to manage younger siblings on the sidelines. I'll have volunteers or assistant coaches blowing whistles according to the rules of the game, just like the referees will. I have athletes wear their game shirts and their game kits as much as possible, so their bodies get used to the feelings of those kinds of like different kinds of fabrics and clothes. We do have athletes with sensory integration needs or challenges, so I think even wearing the game uniform can help the brain get used to that feeling, right? So that's not an additional piece of sensory input that the brain has to navigate. The other thing I'll say is the clocks, the competition clocks. I have those going as soon as I feel like all of our athletes can understand their purpose. And yeah, so I have those going just to get everybody used to seeing the clocks and feeling the stress of the clocks as early as possible, because if you go in cold with athletes not used to, seeing time tick down or hearing the buzzer when the clock is set off, it really can be jarring. So that's one thing I do introduce very, very early on. And those were the two questions that I got from Jeff. I think that's it. So I just want to say thank you to everybody. This has been wonderful. And I appreciate you being here. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the wonderful presentation. The information will be so beneficial to all our Special Olympics coaches. I hope you'll learn a thing or two. So Special Olympics offers a number of fantastic resources for coaches to continue to learn and improve their coaching knowledge. The Special Olympics online learning portal, has a huge number of courses relating to coaching, fitness, health, and protective behaviours. So the link to the online learning portal is in the chat. The Special Olympics website hosts a number of different resource pages for different areas. Be sure to check out resources.specialolympics.org to access all of the amazing resources, including unified sports, divisioning, and young athletes. All of these pages will help you with your coaching of Special Olympics athletes. This year, we continue to have our interactive dashboard for you to engage more with the webinar series. Here you'll find links to resources, recordings of webinars, the presenter slides, and the option to ask our presenters and host questions. This interactive dashboard is your one-stop shop for everything coach webinar series related. The next webinar is on Thursday, and that will be about how young people learn and what it means for Special Olympics coaches with our partners at I Coach Kids. Thank you again to our partner, Gallagher, for their support of the 2024 Coach Webinar Series. Register now if you haven't already, so you don't miss out on all of the fun and the learnings. That's all from me. Goodbye for now.